A wealthy businessman refuses treatment from a black doctor, convinced that only a white physician is capable of helping him. But when his son's life is suddenly at risk, he must face the very prejudice he harbored and beg the doctor he rejected for help. What happens next will leave you questioning everything. Before starting the story, comment where are you watching from? Hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for more stories. It was a typical morning at the prestigious Riverstone Medical Center, but for businessman Richard Greaves, something was off. The gleaming marble floors, the soft rustling of nurses' footsteps, and the soft hum of medical machines all blended into an antiseptic harmony, but none of it seemed to ease the tightness in his chest. Richard sat in the spacious lobby, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as he shifted in his seat. Everything about the hospital screamed wealth, exclusivity, and professionalism, but the unease gnawing at him wouldn't subside. His admission for routine surgery should have been a simple matter, a mere blip in his otherwise organized, high-powered life. But the moment the nurse informed him of who would be overseeing his surgery, his heart skipped a beat. Dr. Naomi Clark, a black woman, was to be his primary physician. The words hit Richard like a cold slap. His grip on the armrest tightened involuntarily, his knuckles turning white. He had heard of Dr. Clark before, of course, her name was well respected in the medical community, but there was something about the idea of her being in charge of his health that set his nerves on edge. Richard had grown up in a world where power, control, and status meant everything. He'd climbed the corporate ladder with meticulous precision, ensuring that every decision he made reflected his values, his belief that the world worked a certain way, that people who were deserving held power and privilege, and that some were better suited for leadership than others. Dr. Clark, to him, was an anomaly. How could someone who didn't fit his idea of authority hold the reins over his well-being? He shifted uneasily in his seat, eyes darting toward the nurse at the front desk, a young woman who seemed far too calm, too composed for the conversation that was about to unfold. The sterile environment of the lobby felt suddenly oppressive, the air thick with tension. The nurse looked up at him, waiting for a response. "I'm sorry, but I won't be treated by her," Richard declared, his voice a hard, cold edge that cut through the air. His eyes never left the nurse's, as if daring her to argue. "I want a white doctor. I don't trust someone from her background." The nurse's eyes flickered with shock. She blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. She'd heard difficult requests before, demanding patients, disgruntled clients, but never anything quite like this. The air seemed to shift, the polite, professional mask she had perfected for these kinds of situations now slipping slightly. She swallowed, trying to maintain composure. "Mr. Greaves, I understand your concern," she said, her voice strained, though she quickly shifted into the practiced calm that Riverstone's reputation demanded. "I will make sure your request is addressed immediately. Please, wait here." As she turned to leave, Richard could feel a brief flicker of something, maybe guilt, but he shook it off. This was his health at stake, wasn't it? He couldn't risk putting his life in the hands of someone he felt uncertain about. The very thought sent a cold shiver down his spine. He needed someone who he could trust implicitly, someone who fit the mold of what a doctor should be. That wasn't Dr. Clark. He watched the nurse walk away, her back straight but her pace quickening. Richard leaned back into the cushioned chair, staring blankly at the sparkling white walls, but his mind was far from calm. He'd made the right decision, hadn't he? He had always been a man of logic, of reason, and this felt like the right choice. There was a reason people with his background held power. They were capable. They were trustworthy. But as the minutes dragged on, a creeping doubt began to take root in the back of his mind. He glanced around at the faces in the lobby, none of them seemed to be staring at him, yet he couldn't shake the sensation that they were all quietly judging him. His pulse quickened as the weight of his own thoughts pressed in on him. Could he be wrong? Should he reconsider? He dismissed the idea almost immediately. He didn't have the luxury of second-guessing his choices. After all, this was his health, his future on the line. His train of thought was interrupted when the nurse returned, this time with a different expression, nervous but determined. "Mr. Greaves, I've found another surgeon for you. Dr. Patel, a highly skilled physician," she said, her tone now more measured. "I'll arrange everything for your procedure to be handled by him." Richard exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His shoulders relaxed, his mind immediately at ease. It was over. He had made his choice, and everything was now in place to ensure his comfort. Still, a small part of him felt uneasy, almost as if there was a flicker of something he couldn't fully grasp. He brushed it aside. His concerns were behind him now. But little did Richard know, his decision to refuse Dr. Clark's care would lead to far more than just a change of doctors. As the day unfolded, he would soon find himself caught in a series of events that challenged everything he thought he knew about trust, power, and the true meaning of competence. What seemed like a simple request would soon become the catalyst for a revelation that would force him to confront his own prejudices and the limits of his understanding. In a few short hours, Richard would learn that the woman he dismissed was no ordinary doctor. Dr. Naomi Clark was more than just a physician. She was a force that would reshape everything he believed about people like her, and, ultimately, about himself. Hours later, Richard sat in his sterile hospital room, the smell of antiseptic and the hum of machines swirling around him, but his mind was far from the procedure awaiting him. He couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Naomi Clark. His rejection of her earlier that morning felt almost surreal now, but the discomfort that had gripped him when he heard her name lingered like a shadow. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd made the wrong call, even if he refused to admit it. Why, he wondered, were people like her allowed to practice medicine? Surely there were plenty of qualified white doctors who could do the job just as well, if not better. But as his thoughts spiraled into that familiar territory, he barely noticed the passage of time, until the door to his room swung open sharply, cutting through his swirling thoughts. A nurse entered, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a clipboard. "Mr. Greaves," she said, her voice tight with urgency, "there's an emergency with your son. He's been rushed to the ER." Richard's stomach twisted as his pulse spiked. The calm routine of the morning shattered instantly. "What happened?" His voice cracked, the words tasting foreign as panic surged through him. "He's in critical condition," the nurse continued, her voice strained but steady. "We're doing everything we can, but his situation is dire. We need to stabilize him, and we need Dr. Clark to intervene. She's the only one who can handle this." The room seemed to tilt as Richard's world narrowed to a singular, suffocating point. His son, Kyle, was 8 years old. His only child. The image of his bright eyes and infectious smile flashed in his mind, a boy with so much life ahead of him. The reality of the situation crashed over him in waves. His son was in grave danger, and the one doctor who could save him was the very person he had rejected just hours before. Richard's breath caught in his chest. "No, I can't," he muttered, the words barely escaping his lips, as if saying them out loud might make the situation more real. He shook his head, trying to process the impossible reality in front of him. He had turned her away. He had made his choice. This couldn't be happening. He couldn't let it be. But the nurse's steady gaze did not waver. "I understand your hesitation, sir," she said softly. "But Dr. Clark is the head of our pediatric trauma team. She's the best we have. She's the only one capable of stabilizing him right now." The nurse's words were like cold water to Richard's face. His son's life was at stake. He had no more time for pride, no room left for stubbornness. The flickering doubt in his chest, had he been wrong, morphed into a rush of panic and helplessness. His mind scrambled for an alternative, some way out of this situation that didn't involve putting his son's life in the hands of the woman he had so callously dismissed. But there was nothing. His son was in critical condition, and time was running out. "Please," the nurse urged, her voice quiet but firm. "Dr. Clark is the only one who can help him now. We're waiting on your approval to proceed." Richard's pulse raced as he stood up from the bed, his legs momentarily unsteady beneath him. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. He felt as if he were in a fog, the walls of the room closing in on him. Everything in him wanted to reject the idea, his pride, his prejudice, all of it pushed against the very notion of accepting help from the woman he had deemed unworthy just hours before. But when he closed his eyes, all he could see was his son. Kyle was in pain. Kyle needed him. There was no room for anything else. With a heavy sigh, Richard's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him. He nodded slowly, the words almost sticking to his throat as they left his lips. "Fine," he whispered, his voice a hollow echo of the man he once was. "Send Dr. Clark." The nurse nodded and quickly left the room, and for a long moment, Richard stood there, staring at the empty door. His mind whirled in chaos, spinning between regret, shame, and a bitter sense of helplessness. What had he done? How could he have been so blind, so dismissive? The seconds ticked by slowly, each one a weight pressing down on his chest. He had put his son's life in jeopardy for his own misguided beliefs, and now all he could do was wait for the woman he had rejected to walk through the door and save the child he loved more than anything in the world. A knock on the door broke his trance, and when it opened, Dr. Naomi Clark entered, her presence commanding yet calm. The same woman he had so arrogantly dismissed now stood before him, the very person who could save his son. Her expression was serene, unruffled by the tension that clung to Richard's every move. She looked at him for a moment, as if weighing the circumstances, but there was no judgment in her eyes, just a quiet, professional focus. She turned her attention to the nurse, who quickly filled her in on the situation. Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. He wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, but the words caught in his chest. Instead, he stood there, silent, his eyes fixed on Dr. Clark as she moved with purpose, ready to save his son's life. In that moment, the full weight of his actions, the weight of his prejudice, his refusal, crushed down on him. He had made a terrible mistake. But there was nothing to be done about that now. The woman he had rejected was his son's only hope. And as Dr. Clark prepared to leave, Richard realized he had no choice but to trust her. For his son's sake. Time seemed to stretch and warp as Richard rushed down the sterile, white hallway toward the emergency room. Each step felt like it took an eternity, his heart pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder of the panic clawing at him. The distant sounds of urgent voices and the frantic beeping of machines intensified as he reached the ER, the chaos unfolding before his eyes in sharp contrast to the calm demeanor he had once tried to project. Kyle, his 8-year-old son, lay unconscious on the bed, his small body hooked up to a tangle of monitors and 4 lines. The steady beep of the heart rate monitor wavered dangerously, its rhythm no longer smooth but erratic, jagged. Richard's mind raced, the horrific thought that his son might not survive this assaulting him like a tidal wave. The sterile walls around him seemed to close in, and the weight of the moment pressed down on his shoulders. He rushed to Kyle's side, his fingers trembling as he gripped the boy's tiny hand. "Please," Richard pleaded, his voice cracking, no longer filled with the cold arrogance that had marked his earlier actions. Now, there was only desperation. "You have to get Dr. Clark. She's the only one who can help him." The nurse, moving with quick efficiency, paused, her face taut with the weight of the situation. She glanced at the monitors before locking eyes with Richard, the unspoken tension palpable. She hesitated for only a second, as if weighing the gravity of his request. The vulnerability in Richard's voice, something raw, something real, must have reached her. Without a word, she nodded, a single, sharp motion. "I'll notify her." Richard barely noticed as she disappeared out the door. He remained at Kyle's side, his eyes locked on his son's frail form, wishing he could trade places. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last, each passing second a brutal reminder of how little control he had. His mind raced, caught in a whirlwind of guilt and fear. The woman he had so easily dismissed, the one he had refused in his blind arrogance, was now the only person who could save his son. How could I have been so wrong? The thought ricocheted in his mind over and over again. His earlier decision felt like a distant memory, a mistake so glaring and foolish that he could hardly believe it had been his own choice. He had let his prejudice control him, and now his son's life hung in the balance because of it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door to the ER swung open with a sharp click. Dr. Naomi Clark entered, her steps measured, her presence filling the room with a quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. She scanned the situation with a practiced eye, taking in Kyle's condition, the machines, the frantic nurses working to stabilize him. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he watched her move with purpose, her focus unwavering, her calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the panic that gripped him. She was here, the very woman he had so stubbornly rejected. And now, she was the one who had the power to save his son. He swallowed hard, the bitter taste of his pride weighing heavily on him. His throat was tight, but he forced the words out. "Dr. Clark," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He took a step forward, his eyes pleading. "Please. I need your help. I was wrong. You're the only one who can save him." Naomi turned her gaze toward him, her eyes calm and steady, as if she had been expecting this moment, as if she had seen it all before. There was no judgment in her expression, no trace of resentment, just an unwavering resolve to do what she did best. Save lives. She met Richard's gaze with a quiet strength, as if to reassure him that all was not lost. "We'll save him, Mr. Greaves," she said, her voice low and steady, but filled with an undeniable confidence. "You can count on that." Richard could hardly breathe, but something inside him shifted. It wasn't just the urgency of the moment, the realization of how much he had failed to recognize her worth. It was the overwhelming sense of relief, of trust, that surged through him. She wasn't here to punish him, to prove a point. She was here to save Kyle. That was all that mattered now. Naomi turned to the team, already issuing calm, authoritative instructions, her movements precise and practiced. Richard took a step back, his legs weak beneath him as he watched her take charge. She wasn't just doing her job. She was doing it with a level of expertise that left no room for hesitation, no space for doubt. This was her world. This was where she belonged. And in that moment, Richard understood, truly understood, the depth of his mistake. He couldn't undo the harm he had caused earlier, but he could let go of his pride. He could trust her now. For Kyle. For the child who meant everything to him. As Naomi worked with the team, Richard watched in awe as she seamlessly orchestrated the chaos of the room, her presence commanding the space like a conductor guiding an orchestra. The urgency of the situation had not left, but her calmness was infectious. The steady rise and fall of Kyle's chest, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, slowly started to stabilize under Naomi's expert care. Richard couldn't say how long it took, but as the minutes passed, the tension in the room began to ease, bit by bit. The color began to return to Kyle's face, the irregular heartbeat now less erratic. A soft, relieved sigh escaped Richard's lips as he realized his son was going to make it. For the first time since he had entered the ER, Richard felt a flicker of hope. And in that moment, he realized something he would never forget. Sometimes, the greatest form of strength lies in the humility to admit when you're wrong. As Naomi took charge, Richard stepped back, his heart in his throat. He watched as she worked with surgical precision, her movements confident, focused. The hours passed in a blur, and Richard was left pacing, racked with guilt. When it was over, Naomi turned to him. "Your son's stable now. He's going to be okay." Relief washed over Richard like a tidal wave, but it was tempered with something deeper, shame. His son's life had been saved, but not by someone he trusted. No, it had been saved by the very woman he had dismissed earlier. He could barely look her in the eye. I don't know what to say. I thought someone like you couldn't." Richard stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Naomi's gaze softened. "I understand. But the truth is, we're all just people doing our best, Richard. Race doesn't make anyone more or less capable. It's the heart that matters." As Richard sat by his son's bedside, watching Kyle sleep peacefully, the weight of everything that had just transpired seemed to crush him in waves. The steady rise and fall of his son's chest, the soft, rhythmic sound of the heart monitor, these small signs of life were all that mattered now. But the gnawing sense of guilt lingered in Richard's chest, a constant reminder of how close he had come to losing his son due to his own stubborn prejudice. The moment Naomi had entered the ER, calm and collected, offering the only chance at saving Kyle's life, Richard had felt an overwhelming sense of shame. How could I have been so blind? Naomi had been right. It wasn't race that had made the difference, it was skill, dedication, and heart. In that critical moment, the color of her skin hadn't mattered at all. What mattered was that she was the best at what she did. She had saved his son's life, not because of anything other than the fact that she was more than capable, more than qualified, and most importantly, more than willing to fight for her patients. Richard sat there for a long while, staring at Kyle, the small, steady breath of a child who had come so close to being lost. How many others, he wondered, had been denied care because of ignorant assumptions? How many had suffered because of something as shallow as race? The thought unsettled him. It made him feel small. And in that discomfort, he realized just how much work he had to do, both on himself and in the world around him. The next morning, Richard knew he couldn't let this moment go without doing something. He had to own his mistakes, confront them head-on. The shame was still there, gnawing at him, but he couldn't ignore the powerful lesson Naomi had given him. He walked into the hospital with a heavy but determined heart, his steps echoing in the quiet hallways. He found Naomi's office with ease, the door ajar just enough to allow him to knock without disturbing her too much. Richard took a deep breath, bracing himself. His nerves felt like a tangled mess inside, but this was something he had to do. "Dr. Clark," he began when she looked up from her desk, her expression calm, measured, as if she had anticipated this moment. "I need to apologize. I was wrong. I let my ignorance cloud my judgment, and I almost lost my son because of it. I'm sorry." Naomi's gaze met his, cool and steady, no hint of judgment in her eyes. She could have made this an uncomfortable moment, but she didn't. She could have given him a lecture, a long-winded speech about the cost of prejudice. Instead, she simply nodded, her expression thoughtful but unbothered by the weight of his apology. "I appreciate your apology, Richard," she said, her voice steady and soft. "But what matters most is that your son is alive. That's all that matters." Richard felt a strange relief flood through him, though the sting of his past actions still lingered. Naomi wasn't looking for vindication, and she wasn't interested in making him feel worse about himself. She had simply done her job, saved a life, and she wasn't here to revel in it. She had no need to hold it over him, and that realization hit him with an even greater weight. As he left her office, Richard knew one thing for certain: the prejudice that had once clouded his judgment was gone. Completely. And it had taken the life of his son, almost lost, and the skill of a remarkable doctor to show him that truth. There was no denying it now. He had learned the hardest lesson a father could learn, and in the process, he had been given a gift, one that could change everything about the way he saw the world from here on out. In that moment, Richard Greaves wasn't just a businessman anymore. He wasn't just the man who had thought he could control every aspect of his life, his wealth, his family. Now, he was a father, humbled, enlightened, and irrevocably changed. The fight against prejudice, he realized, starts in our hearts, in the way we see and treat others, and in the way we confront the hard truths about ourselves. Sometimes, the greatest lessons come in the most unexpected ways. Richard had never imagined that a single mistake, born from ignorance and fear, could become the catalyst for a transformation that would echo throughout the rest of his life. But it had. He had come face to face with his own prejudices, and more importantly, he had come to understand that the true value of a person is not defined by the color of their skin or the shape of their background. It's defined by their actions, their heart, and their commitment to doing what is right, regardless of the obstacles they face. Richard walked away from that office with a newfound understanding that would stay with him forever. He had learned that the greatest obstacle to a better world isn't just ignorance, it's the willingness to confront that ignorance and embrace the truth.